The proceeding is currently in private.
Order, order, and welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee and for our inquiry this morning. We're very grateful to the first panel who've joined us, and can I ask each of you very briefly to tell us who you are, starting with Ben Harrison.
Morning, I'm Ben Harrison. I'm Director of the Work Foundation at Lancaster University. We're a policy unit that's focused on supporting people into well-paid, secure employment, particularly those who face structural disadvantages in the labour market.
Very much. Jamie Thunder.
Good morning. My name's Jamie Thunder. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at Z2K, an anti-poverty charity that also provides advice, support and representation on social security issues.
Thank you. Shoesmith.
Hello, I'm Kate Shoesmith. I'm Deputy Chief Executive at the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. We're the professional membership body for the UK recruitment industry.
Thank you. And Gareth Parry.
Good morning, Gareth Parry from Maximus. We're an employment services provider and deliver employment services contracts for central, regional and local governments.
Thank you all very much for being with us. I've got the first question, and it's really a question I think to Kate and Ben. Do you think we're right to be concerned about increased economic inactivity, even though if you look back over kind of 30 years, it's not particularly low at the moment compared with where it's been in the past? How do you think higher inactivity, and indeed also relatively high long-term unemployment at the moment, how do those affect businesses and the economy? Ben, just start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you are right to be concerned about it. It is right that when you just look at the kind of headline figures, they aren't dramatically higher than perhaps they have been in the past. But I think what matters is when you get underneath that headline figure to understand what are some of the drivers of that economic inactivity, particularly with regards to ill health. And the record number of people, 2.8 million now, who are economically inactive due to ill health, and that is rising and has been rising for a number of years now. That's clearly a significant concern. And then alongside that, when you think about some of the worker groups that are particularly impacted as well, so young people, for example, coming out of education and not finding their way in the labour market, actually falling into economic inactivity at that stage of their working life, has a whole host of really significant implications. And then I think to the sort of the second part of your question, Chair, I think the kind of impacts for the economy and for the exchequer and for society more broadly are equally very significant. So if one thinks back to the pre-pandemic period, we're broadly about 1 million workers short from what you might have anticipated we would be at today, given the shifts that we've seen over the course of the last 4 to 5 years. That means businesses have faced worker shortages across a number of different sectors in recent years, particularly hospitality, logistics, social care. I think there's also kind of wider implications for confidence in the UK economy as a whole, should these trends continue, and it certainly looks as if, from a perspective of ill health, that they might, particularly with regards, thinking about the pipeline of talent for the future, if this continues to impact young people. There's clearly significant impacts for the exchequer when it comes to the cost implications from a welfare perspective, but also from a health perspective. That's going to have very significant implications for government spending decisions more broadly. And then obviously there's going to be a really significant societal impact and impact for individuals who find themselves in these circumstances too. So the headline figure may not be that much bigger than it has been in the past, but I think the reasons for that inactivity and the groups that are primarily experiencing it mean that it is right to
when
focus on.
Did the increase in ill health inactivity start? Is that a sort of post-pandemic phenomenon, or did it start before then?
So, the rising reporting of ill health had been happening for some time prior to the pandemic. But both in terms of mental health, but also physical health as well. But yes, we've seen a kind of significant jump over the course of the last 5 years of that then manifesting itself into economic inactivity.
Thank you. Kate?
If I start from the other end of the spectrum from Ben, so at the REC we collect an awful lot of jobs data, as you would expect. One of the things that we do with Lightcast is we look at job vacancy postings. So Labour Market Tracker, and we've done this since May 2020. For the last month, So for the month of February and March, we saw that there were 1.9 million active job vacancy postings across the UK economy, 800,000 of which were added during the month of March. So we still see, even though the labour market has significantly slowed down from the post-pandemic highs that we had as we came out of lockdown in 2021 and 2022, we still have quite high demand for work. So when we're talking about yesterday's figures were 700,000 people economically inactive, more than we had from the pandemic, pre-pandemic times. That's still a considerable burden in terms of employers looking to recruit. And Ben's right, some of the sectors where that split is seen in particular is where we're really feeling it in terms of that labour market activity. So from our perspective, it's a problem, and it's causing there to be a slowdown in growth that could otherwise be developed. It means that businesses don't have the ability to hire the talent they necessarily need. Not in all cases, but in terms of some of the roles that are currently available. So there's another part of the equation, if you like. And then in terms of, is it different from what we saw pre-pandemic? I think some of the things are different, and perhaps I'll do this more on an anecdotal basis. So from a recruiter perspective, from about March 2021, they were beginning to pick up signals that there were more people over the age of 50, I'm going to struggle to call them old, more people over the age of 50 who were actually making different decisions about work and saying, actually, I'm not going to be looking for work anymore or for this foreseeable period because of different things that have happened. Reassess my priorities, experience burnout over the pandemic, particularly those working in health services. Won't be picking up extra shifts anymore, have to reconsider my family commitments and priorities, reconsidered my lifestyle, all of those things. They were picking that up, and they were picking up signs that people had health conditions where they might have been existent in the past, but were becoming more and more pronounced and were preventing people from taking on more work. So from an anecdotal basis, we've definitely felt a shift there, and it feels like a different jobs market to the one we had pre-pandemic.
Thank you very much. Sir Desmond Swain.
So continuing with that, Kate and Ben, people in their 30s and 40s are much more likely to be economically active than younger workers and older workers. Why is that, and what can we do about it?
There isn't a single straightforward answer to that. I think that the kind of circumstances vary quite significantly, even within those two age demographics, either younger workers or those towards the end of their working life. We know that for some workers getting towards the end of their career have taken early retirement over the course of the last few years, and Kate has just described some of the circumstances that may have surrounded that. I think equally we know that there are instances where particularly those older workers who have been in quite physically demanding jobs have reached a point within their career where they are finding that harder to sustain and may not really know what to do instead or next, and may need or may have benefited from support to transition into different kinds of roles at that point of their working life, but actually found that support wasn't there and have therefore kind of dropped out of the labour market as a result. I think to the kind of the other end of that spectrum around young people, as I mentioned, reported poor mental health is a very significant factor here. Research from the Resolution Foundation published a few weeks ago has found that 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds are reporting a common mental health disorder, so things like anxiety, depression, bipolarity disorder, and that's a big increase since 2000, where that figure was around 1 in 4. So there is a kind of general sense that young people's mental health is getting worse, and that then is having a kind of flow through into some of those numbers around inactivity that we see. It seems to be particularly pronounced when poor mental health is aligned with poor educational attainment as well. So if those two things coalesce, then young people are more likely to fall out of the labour market.
There's another part of the trend in terms of young people. Whenever there's any form of downturn or there's perhaps less elasticity, if you like, one of the things that we definitely see in the jobs market is that there are fewer opportunities given to young workers. Partly that's self-driven. So that will be, young people will be choosing to stay in education. Now, it could be that they're informed by their parents that that's the safest bet right now. So we saw, particularly when you look at the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, that young people were staying in education longer or restudying or retraining rather than entering a jobs market where there wasn't that certainty. Now, the longer that goes on, the more it becomes apparent that you need to be building up experience and work experience, and how that works in tandem with the careers advice, the work experience services that are available. There's something there, and it's Ben's right, there's other factors going on. I've already mentioned about in terms of older people. I think one of the things that we really need to be thinking about is what is the programme for career returners. And so if it's the people in the broadest sense, so whether that's people coming into work having had childcare responsibilities, increasingly we see a trend where there are grandparents who are taking up some of the slack there because of the lack of childcare provision. So, but when the children are a bit older, what do they do in terms of getting back into work, given that there's a considerable amount of time left before that they will be pensionable age or could still work beyond pension age. So how we have a properly devised career returner programme becomes all important.
But there isn't anything specific in the Back to Work programme to encourage older workers back into the market. What should there be?
There should be specific tools that can help employers understand how they can engage with people who have a myriad of skill sets, but they might have a gap on their CV. And one of the things that we often find is that when somebody presents with a period of time where they've not been in work, that this can be an immediate barrier to the employer thinking about what do we do? How do we draw out the skills and make their experience relevant to the world of work? How have they kept up to date? So I think there's got to be a sense of, well, what is the training that's available to be up to date? It could be within a particular sectoral discipline. Particularly one of the things that people lack confidence in is digital skills and the rise of AI, and we're all going to have to adapt and use those. But also thinking about employability programs. It's actually quite hard to find a job and navigate your way through the system. So being trained specifically on what do you do to manage the availability of vacancies out there, how do you select, how do you apply, how do you get through the applicant tracking system, that there's specific, almost technical things that need to be part of an employability program.
Just to add, thank you. I think there's also interventions that probably don't sit within the Back to Work plan itself, but around things like support for childcare and for social care that could have a really big impact on this group of workers. So, there's emerging evidence that because of things like later family formation as well as a kind of ageing population, there's a growing number of people in that 40 to 55 age bracket who have not only work to think about, but also care for young people as well as elderly relatives as well. I think they're being referred to as sandwich carers. I'm not too sure about that term. But that clearly creates a significant pressure on those individuals. It takes a toll on their health itself, but it also clearly puts a kind of big pressure around the amount of work that they're able to take on. So investments in childcare infrastructure, investments in social care could have a positive impact on this as well.
There are a significant number of workers, elderly people, with skill sets that we require, who are economically inactive because they don't need to be and can live well enough. How do we encourage them, if indeed it's at all possible, back into the labour market?
Some of it has to be about personal choice, right? But I do think one of the things that we perhaps need to be building up is our financial acumen and awareness of each and every one of us. One of the things that we don't do very effectively is plan for the very last stages of a retirement, and I think some of this is not our data. There's figures out there that shows many of us underestimate longevity and how long we actually live for, and that the last stage of life, when care is often required, is often the most expensive. So there's a big piece about how do we build up that understanding of what actually a long retirement may look like. I think a number of people do want to work in some capacity, is another feature of this, but it doesn't have to be a full-time, permanent, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 job. And that flexibility is all important, because actually if that's the choice that's being made, is that I need to be in a permanent job or not work, then that's often the struggle that people are facing. And I think we've got to build up the greater acceptance. Particularly, Ben makes a critically important point about the fact that there's not necessarily the full infrastructure there for everybody to benefit from childcare, and that's why we're relying on grandparents to fill in some of those gaps. So how does that support? And then that's also where you can have flexibility in and around that, so that you can manage those different, and it's not just childcare, is it? It's caring responsibilities more broadly, and increasingly we're finding that people are caring for members of their family, and that's preventing them from entering work.
I think just very briefly, I agree with everything Kate has said. I do, though, think we probably need to be realistic about the numbers of people in the scenario that you've described that will come back without something changing in their personal circumstances. I think the things that Kate has talked about there, mean that if somebody does want to work, that would give it a better chance of that transition being possible. I suppose what I would add is a sort of a further endorsement around the importance of flexibility and the quality and security of that employment, in order to for that individual it to feel worthwhile doing, and that it's going to be a kind of reflection of their valued experience and skills that they're bringing into a workplace. But ultimately, I think if somebody has opted for early retirement, if they do have independent wealth and they can financially plan for the future, I think we probably have to be realistic about the number of those that will return.
So how much difference will the Back to Work plan make?
There's elements of it. The particular strengths in terms of the support for Ben's already outlined the cases in terms of the caseload in terms of mental health provision and what's going on there. So there's elements that really do need to be worked on. I think one of the things that's been pleasing in terms of our engagement with the Department for Work and Pensions of late is how they've brought that together with the Health Department, and that's long been necessary, because actually many of the barriers that we have are not necessarily about the jobs being available or work finding support necessarily. It's about the health conditions. So it's got to be seen as a partnership in terms of that health and that work finding support. And actually there's fundamental pressures there of how do you get the NHS waiting lists down? How do you provide enough care and support for all the conditions that are being described that come after, and those barriers to work after you've thought about the employability programme, because there's things that are preventing people from working and participating in employability programmes.
So I think it's very welcome that the government has prioritised expanding existing support programmes, an emphasis on tailored support and kind of deep dive support for those who need it. There's elements of the universal support scheme that I think are certainly positive. And likewise, the kind of trying to expand access to mental health care provision, for example, again, very positive. But I think there's a risk here in only focusing on the part of the problem which we can see today, which is the numbers who have already dropped out of the labour market. I think there's probably a bigger challenge around how do we stem the flow in the future and enable people to remain in work who are currently in work but are suffering with a health condition. And I think that then speaks to a sort of much broader range of interventions, from improving public health and investing in public health to try and take a more preventative approach to ill health, through to improving the security of work contracts and the quality of jobs, so that we're not seeing so many people experience precarity at work. We've talked a lot about young people so far in the discussion. Young people are 2.2 times as likely to be in severely insecure work as other age demographics. If you put yourself in the shoes of a young person who has a mental health condition, that is clearly going to be an additional barrier to being able to think about entering and staying in the labour market. And then I think there are other things around the nature of the welfare system, as well as what we've already talked around, flexibility within jobs and that being a day one right, extending access to occupational health at work, and ensuring that there's adequate funding there. At the moment, only around half of the UK working population can access it. I think that's the DWP estimate. And given the kind of challenges we're facing in terms of rising ill health, that doesn't feel particularly sufficient. And then I think finally, as the committee's report of just a couple of weeks ago made clear, that the UK statutory sick pay system doesn't feel fit for purpose, given the challenges that we're facing, both in terms of the level of sick pay that's on offer, but also how that system operates and when people can access it. So I think the kind of some of the core tenets of that back to work plan are certainly positive. I think there's a question about scale and a question about longevity of funding and whatnot around some of that. But I think there's a whole host of other interventions that we should also be thinking about to make sure that fewer people drop out in the future.
Chair, would you mind if I contribute as well?
If you would, yeah.
So I think there's lots to be positive about in the Back to Work plan. I think the extension and expansion of Restart is helpful, but of course Restart is targeting by and large the economically active, not the economically inactive. And there are elements in the Back to Work plan like universal support, which is looking to address the economically inactive bit. And then there's several pilots which, as said, I think are interesting and could provide a good evidence base. I think the challenge, though, is how do you move from one suite of contracts that are in place at the moment to the new proposed suite of contracts in place? What happens in the fallout of the eligibility criteria? Because the new programmes might meet the needs of some new participants but won't meet the needs of others. And there could well be a gap in the provision as you transition from one suite of contracts to a new suite of contracts. So I think I think our view would be that there's a positive sense of overall direction, but the pace at which the Back to Work plan will come in and how the new contracts potentially replace and supersede existing contracts in the context of the relative demand that exists at the moment. So I think we'd probably have some concerns around that.
Pick up some of those points. Thank you very much. Celine Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. Is the government right to couple enhanced employment support with higher sanctions? I don't mind. Who'd like to go?
I'm happy to take that first. So I think there's very little evidence to suggest that heightening sanctions will have a meaningful impact on the issue that we're talking about this morning. I think for a few reasons, really. There's already significant job search requirements within our welfare system, but actually the groups of people that we're talking about here are very likely to be sitting outside of that regime currently. And so it's not clear to me that that would have a significant issue directly on those individuals who are economically inactive. There's, in addition to that, evidence from Manchester Metropolitan University that actually the kind of increase to conditionality and sanctions within the welfare system over the course of the last 5 to 10 years may actually be contributing to some of the challenges that we're seeing. So if you make the welfare system riskier, as it were, for those who have health conditions, then they may feel that they're not going to be able to meet those job search requirements and choose to opt out altogether. And likewise, if you are economically inactive, the idea of coming back into a highly punitive system where you're going to have raised expectations placed on you in order to find work or see your benefits reduced may be a kind of determining factor as to why you wouldn't come back. So I think we've got to be really careful about imagining this as a kind of carrot and stick exercise and actually be thinking much more about how we can de-risk pathways back to work for individuals.
Thank you.
I'd agree with that entirely. I think maybe if I take it from a practical the job line perspective, is some of the things we see are the unintended consequences of this, and actually how it works out is it's a waste of everybody's time and effort. So as an example, we heard from one of our member agencies last week. So a recruiter was sent a particular candidate who was apparently ready for work. They'd been for a particular job. They'd been out of work for 14 years. They weren't work ready. So this individual had been put in a position where, faced with sanctions, they were going to the recruiter to show that they were applying for work. And it wasn't viable that this particular role was going to be for them. The recruiter in this particular instance in a branch office in the West Midlands didn't have the skill set to support this individual, but wants to. So, actively engages with us about what can they do, how can they participate in things like Restart over time. But actually, we're forcing people into situations where, on all parts, there's not the infrastructure to support them, or because there's a concern and a worry about the sanctions regime. So it's about, where are we best spending time on this particular area, and I think there's a particular emphasis of let's let all parts of the system do what they're good at, and is the best use of all of our resources to be having people applying for jobs that they're not fit and ready for. It's frustrating on all fronts, isn't it? And it drives a lack of confidence overall.
Thank you. Gareth, can I come to you now? Back to work plan, which refers to piloting or expansion of several different employment support programmes, including Restart and Additional Job Centre Plus. But it makes no mention of the work and health programme. Is it your understanding that the work and health programme is coming to an end?
Yes, so Work and Health Programme is a specialist disability employment support programme. That contract runs with referrals coming to Work and Health Programme until the end of September. I think it runs a little bit longer in some of the devolved areas, but effectively by the autumn this year, those contracts come to an end. They've already been extended once by the departments, but my understanding is that contract will finish when it's due to finish at the moment. And that's one of those issues around, does that leave a gap in provision? Because Work and Health Programme is a specialist disability support programme, whereas Restart is a larger contract, but it's a more mainstream employment support programme. So when we look at the disability employment gap, we question, okay, and it's good that there is an emphasis on that in the Back to Work plan, but in terms of practical contracts, universal support, I understand, is going to be targeted at economically inactive people with health conditions by and large. But that's a different community of people that currently access Work and Health Programme. So there is the risk of a gap in provision. So I think last time I saw the numbers, it's something like 150,000 people per annum drop out of employment for a health-related reason or a disability-related reason. So you've got a lot of people dropping out of work. If Work and Health Programme in England and Wales and contracts like First Start Scotland in Scotland, if they're not replaced, in England and Wales with Restart, that disabled person going forward will probably have to wait for 6 months before they can access Restart, which is then obviously not a specialist disability contract. So there is the danger that there's going to be some gaps in provision as a result, and that goes back to my comments before about how do you transition from one suite of contracts and provision to another without having those gaps emerge, either timing gaps or eligibility gaps.
And in your view, and within that programme, what worked and what didn't work? What would be your assessment of the programme?
So I think Work and Health Programme, I've worked in the sector for probably over 30 years, and I think Work and Health Programme is one of the better contracts that we've seen. So the ingredients, I think, of what works is being delivered by trained and experienced personnel who've got experience of working in the arena of disability and employment and can give that very practical and pragmatic support. I do think the voluntary nature of the programme means that engagement is better and participation rates are better in that programme. I think it allows, it's quite a what we call a black box programme. It's not over-prescribed, so it can be highly personalised to the individual, so each individual can have their own personal journey through Work and Health Programme. And it allows providers like Maximus to work at a macro level in the one sense, in that we can get the economies of scale of being a large provider and working at scale, but also allows us to really integrate into local communities. So our own models, for example, across our contracts, we work with over 400 very local community-based organisations to deliver those services. So I think those are the kind of ingredients that do work. I think what doesn't work is when employment support journeys are over-prescribed and over-controlled because they can't be personalised enough for people. I don't believe personally that mandated programmes work as well as voluntary programmes. And I think you need to find that blend between what large national provision can do and what very localised specialist provision can do. And I think it's not that one case is better than the other. I think it's the blend of the two.
Thank you. And so the Back to Work plan does not mention intensive personalised employment support either. Was that working, and what's happened to it?
Yeah, well, again, those contracts ran out. So referrals to IPES, as it's known, they finished in November, so we're in what the tail period of that. I think over the life of the programme, I think it's supported around about 9,000 people, but it's targeted at those people with disabilities at the more profound end of the disability spectrum. So it's people with more significant learning disabilities, more profound and enduring mental health issues, sensory impairments. So it's a much more specialist provision. Again, that programme's finished and there hasn't been a replacement programme for that. So people that previously would have gone to IPES, I'll be honest with you, I'm not quite sure where they're going now.
Thank you. And so where you spoke about delivering employment support, you mentioned that blend between sort of local and national programmes. Are there any other things that you think we should be aware of that have particularly worked well in your experience, and particularly for those local programmes, how to do that? Because I know, talking to local suppliers back where I am, they find it very hard because the contracts and processes are very complex for what are potentially very small local employers. Any thoughts around the learnings that we should be taking forward?
I think that one of the roles for larger programmes, recognising that small, local, community-based organisations have a real niche and expertise that large organisations tend to not to have. I think it's really important to take advantage of that. However, at the same time, I think there can be a responsibility for larger providers to nurture and capacity build with smaller organisations as well. And I think larger organisations are in a great place to help coordinate and facilitate more integrated working at a community level. I think local organisations find it quite overwhelming because the whole system is quite complex, whereas a large provider can provide some support with navigating around that system, bringing people together. So what we would do in our delivery models is, focus on how can we manage the case management journey of taking that person towards employment, but also how can that person access childcare, transport support, debt advice, housing support, using a multi-agency approach. And I think large providers are in quite a strong position to be able to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Very much. Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, all, and good to see you all here. Gareth, can I just pick up very quickly on with the ending of the Work and Health programme? You mentioned there potentially could be gaps in support. Do you feel, in your opinion, that there should be specific support in place to really look after the customers, i.e. the ill and disabled people that require that additional support?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've worked in this sector for a long time. My background with Employability prior to Maximus, so I've got a possibly a bias towards that agenda, just to declare that. But I think there has been
warranted.
But I think there's been national provision in place for disabled people in the UK for since just around about the turn of the year 2000. So it's been a long time. So we've had a series of programmes, but they've tended to come on the back of each other, and there's been a continuity of provision, albeit programme design and programme eligibility has changed slightly. This is the first time for a long time that I can remember we're getting to a point where there isn't any specialist disability provision in place for people who require it from November of this year. And I think that's a challenge given that we've still got a disability employment gap of 28-ish%, and we see the rising numbers of people that we talked about, the economically inactive, who are sick and disabled. The Restart's coming on board, but when I look at what the proposals are around the scale of Restart, it meets a slightly different eligibility criteria, different community of people, but it's just not going to meet the level of need, I think, that disabled people have. There will need
to be some plan in place to support that cohort of people, isn't there?
That would be my view, yes, but I can't see that plan at the moment.
No, well, there isn't one. I think we can. But thank you for that. And just one small point as well. In terms of disability employment support, where do you see it in terms of having impairment-specific or disability-specific support for certain groups, i.e. if somebody was blind or partially sighted, having specific support programmes in place for them?
So I think this is where the benefits of some of that universal support can come into play, because universal support as a programme is modelled on traditional supported employment models such as individual placement support, which is a model that grew out the health system, really. Supported employment model grew out the health system for people with severe and enduring mental health issues. So I think that there are proven models out there, and universal support takes the principles of that and says, well, we're going to go for what's known as a place and train approach rather than train people and then place them into work. Place people into work, build a support plan around them to then achieve sustainable work. So I think that's a really positive part of universal support. I have a slight anxiety that the funding levels available to do that to the required level of quality and fidelity that those models come from may not be what the proposed budget levels are. So I think that's another conundrum of how do we get through there. But there are proven models of how to support people with more specific and significant impairments.
So to Kate and Gareth, the government have placed Restart at the centre of the tougher sanctions regime. So how successful has the Restart programme been?
You want me to pick that up? So
it was. Yeah. But it says to Kate and Gareth here, but obviously.
Yeah, I can probably talk a bit more about the scheme. Kate can talk about some of the examples of maybe what's happened on the scheme. So I think the last DWP published statistics said that I think it was just over 500,000, 500,000 people have joined Restart. I think, let me just check my notes. Yeah, I think 43% at that moment in time, 43% had started employment and 29% had been in employment long enough to be what's known as an outcome. I think at the time the statistics were published, the 29% was tracking slightly ahead of the DWP's projections, so I think Restart was perceived to be broadly in line, possibly just slightly ahead of where the expectations were. I guess since then, we've now got the negotiations going on about the extension period as well. So the fact that DWP and the Treasury have approved an extension period, to me, says that there's a satisfaction that there is a return on investment there and there's an economic case for it.
Should it be? Sorry, Kate.
No, I was going to say. So REC we're subcontracted, if you like, via Maximus, and we found it's quite a useful partnership in terms of Restart, because what we're doing is we're building on the deep experience that Gareth and his team bring in terms of employability and that those contract supports, which are very difficult to navigate to the outside world, and bringing in the recruitment part from our members. So where they have the availability of understanding that local jobs market in quite some detail, they can see what roles are available, they can see where the gaps are, they can see the types of clients that are looking for work and who would be a good fit for putting in job seekers from a Restart programme into those roles. So our experience is that we've delivered 2,033. So it's like job starts via the Restart contract, REC members to Maximus. They're in a range of roles in specific regional areas where the contract is available, so manufacturing, construction. In London, actually, there's been a predominance of entry-level roles into the education system, what you'd expect from a London-based economy where you've got more of those professional services type roles going on. And our experience has been of those starts, after the 12-week period, 67% of them are still in work. So it's significantly higher than the overall numbers. So from our perspective, we found it's a good programme, and we've worked on how is it that we are all playing to our respective strengths. So you have DWP who understand the nature of the system. You've got Maximus who truly understand what's needed to deliver some of these contracts, particularly around Restart. And we have our members, the recruiters, who are understanding what it is that's required to be fit for purpose for this particular role. So I think that's the experience that we'd like to see built on, is that we shouldn't expect any of those constituent parts to be doing more than they should. And I think particularly one of the things that we experience is that when you go into Jobs Centre Plus and you talk to work coaches, their portfolio of work that they have to deliver is huge. And why should it be when there's other actors that can support some of that?
So the scheme's been extended, but do you think it should be made permanent?
I think given our experience, if we can build on that, but we need to build on things in the right way. And I think there will be learnings along the way, and I think one of the things that we definitely need to see is a full and structured evaluation of each of these schemes alongside. And so why is this particular programme? What does that do to support people who have entry requirements into the world of work? But what other gaps are there? If you look at the population of both unemployed and economically inactive, there's schemes that will be fit for purpose and appropriate, and each of those strands should be supported, and they may not all be supported by something that looks identical to Restart.
Yeah, you won't be surprised to know that I would like to see longer term commitments. I think that there's caveats that come with that, though. I think that so longer term commitments to employment support would encourage more investment in innovation in things like technology to start to change employment support provision over a period of time. One of the challenges at the moment is it's difficult to make investments for the length of the contracts to get a return on that investment to radically change. But so for example, taking more employment support online is an obvious thing to do. But I think that we also need to be mindful that longer term contracts need to have flexibility for all parties concerned, because what you're delivering on day one of year one does not necessarily reflect the external factors of what's happening on day 365 of year 5. So for the commissioner and the provider, there needs to be an opportunity to say, well, what lessons have we learned? Are there renegotiation points in the contract, depending on some of those external factors, that allow both parties a bit of flexibility to evolve the service over time? I think if that could be built in, then I think moving out to longer term contracts could reap significant benefits for participants, providers and government and the UK taxpayer.
Thank you very much. Nigel Mills.
I mean, slightly counterintuitively, when we've got an issue with lots of people who think they're not capable for work, but the government thinks that they might be, the government have announced the end of the work capability assessment at some point in the future. Is that a change that you think is the right way to go, or do you think it's a slightly unusual step in the current time?
I mean, there's not necessarily a completely straight answer to that, but like many other advice agencies, we regularly see problems with the WCA as it stands at the moment, both in the process and in the decision making. But ultimately, the plans to abolish it and replace it with a combination of relying on PIP to govern the additional access to the additional universal credit and relying on work coaches to take a much greater role in setting conditionality causes more problems than it solves. I mean, yes, it is abolishing the sort of the monolithic WCA, but in a sense it's really just devolving that to work coaches within job centres.
Anybody else got any views on that one? Just you, Jamie. I mean, it seems...
I have plenty of views on this.
I mean, isn't there a risk that you just end up with the PIP assessment being a work capability assessment, even though PIP's not meant to be a means-tested benefit, but we just have to use it as that?
Yeah, PIP is not a particularly reliable proxy for ability to work. It's not designed to test that, and it doesn't test that. But even aside from the criteria, we also still see a lot of problems, as I know the committee's aware of, around decision-making within PIP. We have clients who are absolutely entitled to PIP, but have to really fight to get it, sometimes going from 0 at initial decision, 0 at mandatory reconsideration, and sometimes double enhanced at tribunal. What this would do is place much greater importance on that PIP assessment decision, and until that decision is overturned, leave that person living on the basic rate of universal credit this is someone who, by virtue of the fact they eventually get double enhanced PIP, they have quite significant difficulties. But by putting all of this in one basket, it really adds a lot of risk there. And for all its flaws, the current system of having 2 separate assessments does give a degree of insurance against one of them going wrong.
Do you think? I mean, I don't want to put words in the Secretary of State's mouth, but do you think the stated aim of this, that takes out the stigma or the barrier, and that people aren't sort of told, well, you're not fit to work, so you don't have to, is going to really work, and that it will help encourage people? Will it just stick those barriers in a slightly different place.
Yeah, I think one positive about the white paper was that it recognised that barrier currently exists. We don't think that this is the right solution to it, but it is a genuine problem, and the fear of losing your additional universal credit if you consider work, try work, want to talk to the job centre about work, volunteer, all of that is a genuine barrier to somebody who wants to consider moving back into the workforce, but is afraid of that not being possible, that not being sustainable, or that they're only ready to take those very initial steps, but doing so might see that additional universal credit taken out from under them. So I think there is a genuine problem there that's identified in the white paper, but I think that the way it's going to be, the way that the white paper proposes solving it, it's not going to work ultimately. It's going to open up a lot more problems in a lot more areas.
I mean, the irony of this is there's a cohort of people who can never work, and the best thing for everybody is for them to get whatever support we're willing to give them, not make them miserable and not waste our time and money dealing with them in effect. So we need to kind of identify those. Then presumably there's another cohort of people who might, with a good following wind and lots of support and a bit of luck and finding exactly the right role, might be able to work, but that's not the sort of thing you can industrialise. It's going to be kind of individually tailored stuff. And those you do want to find, but equally, you don't want to be spending a lot of resource, work coach time on a collection of people that are never really going to go into work. I mean, you do want to find the people that you don't want to invest in, don't you? I mean, that's the trick with this.
Yeah, and that is a genuine challenge. And as you say, some people move in and out of ability to work over time. What we have at the moment is a very binary system that, certainly in terms of whether you receive additional universal credit, says either you receive, I think it's gone up recently, it's just over £400 a month, or you get nothing. And that can include people who are in the middle group, what's the LCW, Limited Capability for Work group, as was the RAG in ESA. And that cohort of people are not expected to work currently, yet they receive no additional universal credit. If they make a new claim, if they made a claim several years ago, they might still have some legacy entitlement. But and that binary nature of it, and the size of the drop, if you go from having LCWRA status to not, I think is a real problem in the system as it stands.
What do you think's caused the steep rise in people in the LCWRA? I mean, there'll be some people I read who think it's just because people and advisors and social media groups have worked out how to game the system and worked out what to say, and we need to sort of adapt the system to deal with that. Or is it that the current assessment doesn't work for new health conditions that have come along post-COVID? I mean, what has caused that steep rise?
I'm not sure I've got an answer to that. And what I would say is, our advisors are very good, but they're not miracle workers. So, I mean, I don't think we have, and others on the panel may have other perspectives. We haven't seen any evidence to suggest it's driven by anything other than a genuine rising increase in ill health.
Yeah, not some magical new words your advisors have found that if you write this on the form or say this at the assessment, you'll get through.
If only it were that easy. No.
So, I mean, I guess just to sum up, you actually think that this reform that is probably genuinely designed to help might actually just make this worse?
I think that's our concern. Z2K, we have a piece of work in development around how might you square these circles? What might a better overall system looks like, and in coming weeks and months we'll be happy to share that as well.
Very much. And Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you very much. I'm going to continue these questions if that's okay. So good morning everyone, but perhaps if I could start with Jamie. Something I would like to say is, following on from Nigel's question, is I'm sure everybody's seen the Health Foundation report this morning with projections around ill health and how they will be focused in particular areas of of deprivation, and this is going to continue. So, it is around ill health. We know that 148,000 excess deaths specifically driven by austerity since 2012. But let's think about that in the context of the changes to the WCA and the plans around the changes to the activities and descriptors, including the removal of the mobility activity and others, which I think are quite awful. So, Jamie, could you start? What do you think the impact of that will be?
Yeah, so the immediate impact will be that from at some point next year, which is when these regulations are expected to take effect, according to the OBR, there will be a little over 370,000 people who will not flow on to LCWRA over the course of the next 5 years, who today would be. 230,000 of those would currently get LCWRA on the basis of that mobility, on the mobilising descriptor. The remainder would be around the tightening of the mental health substantial risk backstop within the WCA at the moment. Across these changes and some changes to the LCW activities and descriptors, the OBR estimates that this will mean 10,000 people move into work additional people move into work by 2028-29. That's a considerably smaller number than the 371,000 who would not get LCWR status under these changes. And presumably, that means that remaining group of 361,000 will simply remain out of work for the long term and be living on basic universal credit, despite the fact that they are not going to be working for some time.
You'll be aware, I'm sure, all of you, that the committee is also undertaking an inquiry around safeguarding. I'm thinking of this in the context of the amending the substantial risk regulations in relation to the LCWRA group. The government and ministers have said how committed they are on safeguarding, a precautionary principle and so on. Do you see any contradictions there?
I think there is a contradiction there. We're still waiting for the fine details of the wording of the revised substantial risk regulations, but from the consultation response from government, it suggested it could be limited to people receiving crisis care or with an active psychotic illness. Now, those are clearly important groups who need that safeguard, but at Z2K we regularly see clients who fall outside of those quite narrow groups, but who would undoubtedly be at risk of harm to themselves or others if they were either required to undertake various types of work-related activity on pain of sanction, or if they were not given the additional universal credit that LCWRA entitles you to. And I think that it raises the risk, of course it doesn't guarantee, but it raises the risk of some really devastating outcomes for some individuals. And I think that's quite a dangerous game to be playing.
We have actually asked the government for any assessments they might have undertaken in relation to that, given the doubling of the number of people who have died in the last few years. That's doubling of the number that's investigated by the government. Obviously, that's not the full scale. We don't know what the full scale of deaths or serious harms are. But are you concerned in terms of that number increasing even further?
Yes, I think that this is raising the likelihood of that number increasing, and I think it's important to say that the government's logic around the substantial risk regulations seems to be that it was only intended to apply in exceptional circumstances. And I think there's a really important distinction to be drawn here between exceptional and severe. Substantial risk is intended for however many cases it applies to, not to simply the worst 5 or 10 or whatever %. And so that distinction between exceptional and serious is a really important one that I think is a bit muddled in the thinking at the moment.
You've told us that in your submission to the committee that the government conducted an internal audit of the assessors' applications of the substantial risk regulations. This hasn't been published. Do you know what the contents reveal, and is that a reason for it not being published?
Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information about it. We currently have a complaint with the Information Commissioner's Office around this. We have requested it under Freedom of Information legislation, and we're waiting for the Information Commissioner's determination on that at the moment. Our understanding is that it was a desk-based exercise undertaken by clinicians, I think within DWP, looking at the paper evidence around individuals who'd been placed in LCWRA on the basis of substantial risk, that concluded that a large proportion of those should not have been placed in that category. Now, I think we'd really question, just in general, whether such a desk-based review of a relatively small number of cases can provide a reliable conclusion in that regard. Certainly reliable enough to base policy on. But there's not much more we can say, because although the policy is effectively settled now, it's DWP is currently still refusing to release that.
Right, that's an important one for us to get hold of. Thank you so much. Does anybody want to add anything on WCA?
So it's not specifically on the kind of mechanics of WCA, but what I guess I would say is, from our research at the Work Foundation, we know that those with disabilities and long-term health conditions are already around 1.5 times more likely to be in severely insecure work. So we would have concerns about any reforms that essentially heightened conditionality or punitive sanctions on that group, because inevitably I think it would lead to more of those individuals then having to trade job security for the kinds of flexibility they need in order to manage their health condition and come back into work. So without broader reform around security of employment, that could actually lead to worse employment outcomes for those individuals if they are able to come back into the labour market, because we know that insecure work can have a detrimental impact on health, even for those who don't have underlying conditions. So that would certainly be a concern we'd have.
Very good point, Ben. Thank you. Anybody else? Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. That concludes our questions too. We're very grateful to you all for helping us this morning. If anything occurs to you afterwards, please do feel free to drop us a line, and be interested. And there may well be some points we'll come back to you on in writing as well. So I'd ask you, if you would, to step down. I need to declare order to actually formally interrupt the
proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome back everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, and welcome to our second panel who are joining us. We're grateful to all of you for being here. And let me ask each of you to tell us very briefly who you are, starting with James Taylor.
Morning, I'm James Taylor, Executive Director of Strategy at the disability charity Scope.
Ken Butler.
Ken Butler, Welfare Rights and Policy Advisor at Disability Rights UK.
Thank you. Guzelgun.
Yes, my name is Guzelgun, and I am Head of Policy and Campaigns at Mind. We are here to support people with mental health problems.
Ruth Talbot.
Hi, I'm Ruth Talbot. I'm a single parent. I'm the founder of Single Parent Rights, a campaign group.
Thank you all very much. Nigel.
I guess we can start roughly where we finished the last session. What do you all think of the plan to scrap the work capability assessment? Is this a dream you've had for years, which you think it might end up being a nightmare that we'll regret? Neil, do you want to
Yes, of course. We at Mind are certainly very concerned about the replacement of work capability assessments through PIP, because as you mentioned, they do assess very different things. The work capability assessment is there to determine the impact of a health condition or disability on someone's ability to work, whereas PIP aims to determine the impact of someone's health condition or disability on their ability, everyday life, and specifically on physical conditions and their mobility. And particularly for people with mental health conditions, this change is really problematic because PIP doesn't really capture mental health conditions and fluctuating conditions very well. And we know through our report, reassessing assessments, that whilst people with mental health problems have a lot of issues with the work capability assessment, they have even more issues with the PIP assessments because of these criteria that don't capture mental health conditions and fluctuating conditions. And so replacing work capability assessments through PIP is really problematic and very concerning from our perspective. And some of the reasons of those consequences would be that more than 500,000 people might lose out on their LCWRA element because they wouldn't qualify for PIP under the new proposals. And another element is also that, as I mentioned earlier, the assessors don't usually understand mental health very well, and the personalisation that is being proposed would give more discretion at the hands of work coaches who, in our experience and through our research, we have seen that they wouldn't really capture and understand the mental health challenges that many people with mental health problems have, and therefore lead to wrong assessments, and which then would need to be overturned. And I think the fact that 7 out of 10 decisions go to tribunal and have been overturned just shows that there is a problem with assessments, whether that's both PIP or work capability assessments.
And do you have any views on this?
I agree with everything my colleague just said. One of the problems is just having the PIP assessment as the assessment. As she said, I think the latest figures are 80% of appeals are either one because the tribunal upholds a decision or the DWP actually changes it before it goes to tribunal. So it's not a very effective test even of PIP, let alone someone's work capability. She also mentioned, that people who are in the LCWRA group now but can't get PIP, the qualifying criteria are different, face to lose about £390 a month, which is really quite devastating in income terms. And the other thing is it becomes a work coach lottery. The system for determining whether somebody could undertake certain kinds of work-related activity or get a job is devolved to work coaches who aren't, for want of a better word, medically trained at all. And so consistency of decisions might be lost. I think the PCS union, I think it was the start of this year, published a press release to say that there was 10% understaffing in the DWP in general, but 20% understaffing in job centres, and what they described as an epidemic of poor mental health among job coaches. So there's a lot of stress in the system now, so it's difficult to see how job coaches are well placed to have this new role thrust upon them.
I mean, my experience of constituents is they don't generally have a great deal of time or regard for their work capability assessment medical professional. I mean, the idea that I'm going to trust a work coach and share my biggest issues and concerns and seek their support and want their counselling if they've just told me I'm not getting the extra benefit is extraordinarily unlikely, isn't it? I mean, it's just going to destroy the relationship between them and the claimant. I just can't imagine many work coaches are going to fancy this sort of flicking through the file and going, actually, you do get the extra money, you don't. It seems like a crazy idea.
Yeah. Well, you said it really, but I think it would be good to find out via PCS or somebody else the views of work coaches on that particular issue, because I think it'd be quite important. I think the issue of trust is fundamental, really. I think there's a lack of trust, as you outlined, with healthcare assessors, but with the current system, there's a great deal of mistrust with work coaches as well, even to the extent of people not possibly being interested in voluntary work, but not wanting to discuss it with their work coach on the basis that they'll think, oh, if I say that, then I'll get pressurised in taking paid employment, so I won't do it. The sanctions, I think, sorry if I'm skipping ahead, sorry. There is a programme called the Work and Health Programme that is run partly by charities and private contractors. And what that found was that people who participated voluntarily did much better. More people went into jobs who were disabled. More people got long-term jobs who were disabled. More better paid jobs because they were more likely to get full-time employment. But with the work coach system at the job centre, where things were mandatory, there was nothing like that kind of success. And I think that's the problem, is you've got this one hand, you've got this heavy-handedness, and with the best will in the world, you've got work coaches who are working under extreme pressure and don't have the time to actually discuss things properly and form a working relationship with the client.
Strange old world. I'm not sure 20 years ago we'd have thought we'd have a panel of disability rights activists and people from key charities starting a Save the Work Capability Assessment campaign. But I mean, is it fair to say you all fear that what might be a well-intended reform may end up making the situation worse for the people you represent, and actually we should probably focus on making the assessment better rather than...
I wouldn't say it's well-intended necessarily. I think a large part of it is one of the most clear outcomes of it, because there's been no equality impact assessment of it. So those kind of outcomes aren't known. It's to save money. It's clearly going to reduce the budget. And I think scrapping the work capability assessment has always been an aim of many disability organisations, but not scrapping it and have nothing else in its place and replacing it with something which isn't intended to be a work benefit and resulted in quite devastating income cuts as well.
I mean, we think scrapping it is a good thing. There's a huge amount of distrust. It costs around £200 million a year to run the WCA. About 20% of that is spent on appeals, which we've heard about. Challenge is we're bolting things onto a welfare system that was, fundamentally started 70 years ago, and the labour force and the labour market and the world of work is very different in 2024 than it was in the early 2000s, when some of these programmes we're going to be talking about came into force. So I think the actual challenge that I see is that we're trying to solve problems by bolting things onto the side of an existing system, rather than having the courage and confidence to say, our welfare system is not working for many people who need to use it. How can we really go back to the beginning, work with people who need to interact with it, and build a better system that's based on trust, dignity and respect? Because all we're doing is sort of bolting things onto the side of something that I think we all agree fundamentally isn't working.
Thank you.
Sorry. One thing that I find astounding is that ever since the welfare state began, there's always been some kind of work capability test. Different ones, arguably none of them particularly very good, but there's a recognition that some people can't work even if it's for a temporary basis or more long-term basis because of ill health or disability. And there needs to be some kind of assessment, for want of a better word, to assess those who need the extra support. And now what's being proposed is to have no assessment whatsoever.
Okay. Thank you very much. Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and it's great to see you all here. And just to pick up on the points you were raising, Ken, I think it's important to note that the WCA, yes, we all want to see that scrapped because it was flawed from the get-go, really, but essentially you can't just replace it with PIP because it's a different assessment, which too is also flawed, but as well it has a different function, and I think that's the key to this. But the number of people being assessed under the WCA as having limited capability for work or work-related activity obviously has gone up over the years. Can you set out yourself, Ken, and also Neil, why you think that is?
Well, I think... Sorry.
You go first, Jim.
When I saw that as a possible listed question, and it said that, is this due to assessors being more generous, I thought they missed out the cue laughter at the end. I think one of the problems is, I think, that's what's being put over by some is that there isn't really an explosion of ill health. For example, people aren't depressed and suffering from anxiety, they've just got the blues. Or if you're economically inactive, it's a really bad thing. You know, you mustn't be economically inactive, we don't like you. Or there's a duty to become employed. I think there needs to be, I'm sure my colleague will be able to speak more about mental health and the rising increase in mental health, but that's a reality, and that's why there's an increase. The DWP issued new guidance, because it's not a new idea they've had, to assessors in 2015 to make it much stricter. And well, why hasn't the DWP gone back to say, oh, we need stricter guidance on it? It hasn't. I think withdrawing it, there's no justification for it. I think one of my colleagues earlier said about an internal report, and it was the meeting I was at. I'm sure they said it was based on 100 paper case studies.
100, did you say?
Yeah. And again, that's not been published, which would be really interesting to see that. But no actual assessments were observed. You know, I mean, I think it might be the case if someone's actually saying, well, we don't qualify in the work capability assessment, but I think as a safeguard, there's a real risk of there's a substantial risk to your health. That's got to be evidenced. You know, even healthcare professionals just don't do that on a whim. So I think if I wandered off the subject, I apologise if I...
No, that's fine.
I think this is really an important question, and we think that both DWP and DHSC should look into what the underlying reasons are for this increase. When it comes to mental health, I mean, we have seen an increasing level of mental health problems. There are, at the moment, more than 2 million people trying to access mental health services and waiting to access mental health services. It is estimated that 8 million people are trying to get that support but are unable to. So this is the hidden kind of waiting list for mental health support. We know that our healthcare services are struggling to provide that support at the moment. And in addition to that, we are still in a cost of living crisis. We have seen poverty levels increase over the last years, and we know that there is a strong relationship between poverty and increasing levels of poverty and ill health and mental illness. And so we would really point to these social determinants for the increasing level of mental health problems and for maybe also more people being unable to work. The other side of the coin is obviously also looking at the workplace and the barriers to access employment and people with mental health problems find themselves stuck in insecure and low-paid jobs oftentimes, and which mean that they don't get the required flexibility that they would need to both do work but also look after their mental health, and that they are stuck on low pay, which means they are struggling still financially and have additional worries whilst they are still also dealing with their mental health problems. So there are both of these aspects that I think we need to kind of look at to understand what is currently preventing people from working and why these numbers are increasing.
Absolutely, and you've highlighted some of that here, but also to the point that you also raised, Ken, in relation to the evidence base that the government are using and basing their argument and potentially their policy on going forward is going to be crucial, I think, for us to see that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to follow on from what Nigel and Marcia have been discussing in relation to the work capability assessment. And I think you might have heard some of the questions I asked to the previous panel, which are going to be fairly similar. So we know as the interim to scrapping the WCA, there are going to be changes to the in terms of the removal of the mobility activity in relation to this. And I just wondered if perhaps Neil and Ken want to start, but then please, if anybody else wants to answer as well, what you think the impacts will be. And if you could refer particularly in terms of the, as I say, the contradictions that there may be around a safeguarding approach within the department.
Yes, I'm happy to answer the question with regards to the changes to the substantial risk regulations, because I think that is particularly concerning for us and for people with mental health problems. Mm-hmm. And as mentioned earlier, I think the definition that is currently being used for that to kind of focus on people in crisis and psychotic symptoms, I think, is quite a vague but equally narrow definition, and we'd like to understand better what that means and who falls outside of those definitions. In terms of the safeguarding issues, I think we know that the risk regulations were put in place to ensure that people who, through this very rigid, criteria and assessment approach, would fall outside or wouldn't be appropriately assessed, and that these risk regulations are there to protect their safety and health. And so, particularly for people with mental health problems, this is really substantively important. And I just want to maybe share a case study, actually, of someone who, through the work and capability assessment, was not deemed to be in the LCWRA group, but who struggled, who then through these safeguarding measures were then placed into the LCWRA group. So this is Jonathan. He had numerous physical and mental health problems from working with asbestos and from childhood sexual abuse, which took place after he was abducted from a public transport bus as a child. Jonathan was placed in the LTW group, as I mentioned, not meeting the 15-point descriptors, and a mind benefits advisor supported him through a mandatory reconsideration on the basis that that he was not well enough to engage in work-related activity. The DWP conceded that he was too unwell to engage in the more intensive work-related activity, but said that he could engage in light touch work-related activity. So the suggested activity by the DWP was to research new bus routes and take them and getting public transport to new places. The advisor supported Jonathan to take the case to the tribunal and made the point to the judge that he was being given light touch work-related activities that involved re-traumatizing him around the event that had led him to his childhood sexual abuse. And on that basis, he was granted substantial risk on the ground of substantial risk category. He was able then to be placed in the LCWRA group and not to engage in any work-related activity. And I think this case study just highlights some of those challenges that we've been seeing across the board in terms of that lack of understanding of mental health problems, but also on behalf of assessors or work coaches, and these safeguards are therefore critical for people with mental health problems, so they can not be re-traumatized or be hospitalized because of activities that are required by the job centre or work coaches.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Ken. Do you want to? I'm thinking. So, as well as the substantial regulations, we could also think of the change in the descriptors around the removal of the mobility component.
I think Neil's made some really good points, and also based on experience as well.
Yeah.
So that's why that case study is so valid.
Yes.
I think one of the problems is it's going to change to not affect people who have a physical health difficulty who will be at substantial risk. Now, for some reason, healthcare professionals are getting that about right. What healthcare professionals are being overgenerous with, we're told, is mental health. One of the difficulties, I think, is from what's come out, the criteria will be very medicalised, listing certain health conditions, but also in terms of treatment. For example, you might have to have a consultant or psychiatrist treating you so they can provide evidence. But the problem is, not everybody will have that. Lots of people, as Neil said, I think there's 2 million people waiting for mental health treatment.
Yeah.
You know, if you're waiting, it doesn't mean you haven't got a substantial risk to your mental health.
Yeah.
And with the state of the NHS, then there's bound to be people who are going to be missed out because they don't meet the strict criteria. So I think that's why it's very dangerous.
Yeah. Okay, and the changes, some of the changes that we introduced, no, please don't apologise. They've said it's because the change in working practices, that hybrid working and so on. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, again, it's a bit like healthcare professionals being very generous. The difficulty is, I think, with the changes, one of the difficulties is that one of the DWP buzzwords is personalisation. You're going to see your work coach, it's going to be personalised. You might even call each other by your first names, but it's going to be personalised to you. And yet there's a blanket prohibition placed on, for example, people who get the LCWI mobility descriptor, everybody. There's no personalisation there. There's could be cases where people have difficulty mobilising, but that doesn't just apply outside the home, it can apply inside. They may have other conditions, they may find walking painful or very tiring. They may not have an office type thing to work in. Difficulty in finding a job. I think disabled people are not very well represented in professional and managerial type roles, which are the type of roles that you'd more likely to get home working in. I think 8% of low-paid workers were mainly working remotely, and unfortunately, disabled people tend to be more likely to be low-paid. With, for example, people who need the support of someone else, well, how is that going to work, for want of a better term? You know, will access to work or an employer, under reasonable adjustments, allow you access to somebody who can take you, for example, backwards and forwards to work? How realistic is that?
Very good point.
If I just may, on the assumption or on the kind of statement claim that more people are able to work from home, as Ken said, we don't think that applies to many people who are with mental health problems, but also disabled people who do find themselves in low-paid jobs where that flexibility isn't often offered. Usually these are industries such as retail, hospitality, or the gig economy, and they will be required to show up, and they don't have that flexibility to work from home when they need to. And so that assumption isn't true for many people with mental health problems, and therefore, removing the mobility activity is really problematic.
Very briefly, could you, in relation to the substantial regulations, the government says that the substantial risk provision should only apply in exceptional circumstances. What do you think that means, and what's currently happening? And then how workable is it to specify the circumstances in which the substantial risk provision should apply?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, we want to just acknowledge we are unaware of any inappropriate application of these safeguards, and we would therefore, I think, as Jamie said, we don't think that the increasing number of people who might be placed under LCWRA because of these regulations, that this is a reason because of a wrong kind of interpretation. The numbers have increased, but this is not, because of a wrong kind of application of these risks. And I think what is really important, these safeguards must not be weakened, because there are already LCW substantial risk regulations that also protect people who can engage with work-related activity. And to weaken the LCWRA substantial risk regulation would mean that you would push people to engage in work-related activity which will deteriorate their mental health or really put them at risk. And for people with mental health problems, that risk is real. They can die, and some people have attempted suicide. We know there have been several reports by the NAO which have looked into the increased suicides linked to benefit claims and the risk of losing their financial support. And this is a real risk, and I think it is really dangerous to introduce these changes, and we are against this. Yes.
James, do you? Absolutely. You agree with the points that have been made about that. Ruth, I don't know if you. I know your focus is around single parents, but obviously there are going to be single parents that also may be disabled and also may have mental health conditions. Is there any points that you want to raise?
I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think what I would say is single parents do disproportionately live with disabilities. They do disproportionately suffer from mental health issues for various reasons, and of course poverty. So of course they're one group who will be significantly impacted, disproportionately impacted. But then also these kind of impacts will have a disproportionate impact on them because they're the sole breadwinner. So if their payments are deducted, of course that's more of a struggle. And of course any of the mental health impact of these processes is just them bearing that with their children, not with support necessarily.
Very good points. Very
good.
Ken, I saw you quickly put your hand up. A very brief one.
I think there's, in a way, too much stress on exceptional, and looking back when that was actually first inserted in the regulations, the kind of health problem we got today that didn't exist. I mean, if you've got a substantial risk to your physical or mental health, if you're found to have capability for work-related activity, you've got a substantial risk. It's no use turning around to somebody, well, yeah, but you suffer from psychosis, and most people with psychosis have that, so you're not exceptional. It's ludicrous. I mean, that's the main problem, is the substantial risk. The exceptional is, I think, just there in a way to say to assessors. I don't apply this willy-nilly. It's supposed to be a security blanket.
Right.
But I think that it's to get hung up on the exceptional. Is to fall into a trap of getting too abstract, as I think the government have done by saying everybody's got the blues. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Very much. Dr. Brenner Spencer.
Thank you, Sir Stephen. Can I just pick up on that point just to go for the main questions we'll ask about the substantial risk issue? So sorry, Ken, I didn't quite catch what you were saying. Maybe I've got this wrong, but were you suggesting that everyone with psychosis, by definition, comes under the substantial risk criteria?
No. Perhaps another example, there used to be a system called the Social Fund, which had community care grants, and one of the qualifying criteria was whether you were a family under exceptional pressure. And when I was trying to help people with applications, what decision makers were saying, well, they're a refugee family. All refugee families suffer from exceptional pressure, so they're not exceptional. I think the key thing is there a substantial risk to your physical or mental health? Substantial risk if you're found in effect to be fit for work and not have LCWRA, and that's the significant thing.
Okay.
So, I mean, are you going to classify people who meet that definition I've just said, and say, well, you're not exceptional enough? So yes, there's a substantial risk to your health, mental or otherwise, but we're going to find you fit for work anyway. Sorry about that.
Okay, fine. So it's unrelated to a diagnosis of psychosis. Sorry, okay, that's very helpful. I was a bit confused myself. I mean, when I worked as a consultant psychiatrist, I think I wish I could have prescribed many of my patients jobs, because as we know, that's one of the best things in terms of helping people sustain recovery, particularly in the context of severe mental illness. On the case study that you said, Neil, I was really interested to hear it. Just before I ask slightly more specific questions about it, is that a real case that went to a tribunal? So it's
yes. And it's not their real name, by the way, just to...
No, sure, and sort of pseudo-anonymised. That's helpful. I mean, obviously, I sort of respect the judgment of the tribunal, but from what you said, this threw up a few questions to me, because if the issue was that his work coach suggested that the individual should do a particular mitigation, which was to go in buses, which is clearly inappropriate in the context of the person's personal history, is that case not more demonstrative of, does it demonstrate more, a poor assessment and mitigation, as opposed to whether somebody should be under the substantial risk criterion or not? Because it sounds to me like, from what I've heard and the limited information, in some circumstances Jonathan could work, but the way that he's being proposed to work is clearly inappropriate.
That is correct. I mean, but I think the issue here is that who, under the new regulations and under the new system, work coaches, are engaging with people, and they make these kinds of decisions and calls. And so if in the end it is them who will then say there isn't a risk, I don't see a risk for their safety, then you are left with their decision, and I think that is the challenge.
But taking that back, in the abstract, in the correct
and
environment...
you remove then the option for people to be protected under those safeguards. I mean, currently there is this safeguard for people with mental health problems, but if we're removing it entirely, then they have nothing to challenge that decision, and because the current criteria are so rigorous, they don't capture, and the proposed approach will be even more rigorous and won't capture mental health problems appropriately, and you take away this option for people with mental health problems, which currently protects their mental health and their safety, quite frankly.
So let's dissect this bit, because I think this is really helpful in terms of understanding mind's concern. So in the abstract, it sounds to me that in the right sort of environment, taking the social model of disability, Jonathan could work.
Could you please repeat that?
In the abstract, there is nothing, providing the right support and the right employment opportunity, there's nothing innate to Jonathan that means that Jonathan couldn't work.
I mean, there might be.
There might be. But could we, just for the purpose of this, concede that there is a possibility that he could be put in the correct work situation? So there's nothing, what I'm trying to say is there's nothing involved in doing that means by definition he cannot work. Yeah?
No, of course not.
So the question is how we get to that point. Yeah. How we get to the point where you can work and you can work in a supported environment. And if the assessment is wrong, or there's problems with the assessment, a mechanism to challenge that, to make sure mistakes aren't made, and mistakes are made all the time, and we need to make sure we've got error correction.
Yeah, it is really difficult to judge or make a comment on a particular case because I don't know whether...
You gave the case study.
With Jonathan, it might be possible for him to work from home. It might be possible, or actually in his case, he was deemed as not being able to work due to his mental health problems. He might not be able to do that. There might be some people who are currently in the LTWRA group and who are able to do some work-related activity, but it needs to take account of their particular situation and the mental health issues that shouldn't be triggered by any of those work-related activities.
But what I'm trying to get to, and I'm completely neutral on this substantial risk stuff from what came out of this committee evidence in a sense. I go into it with an open mind in both directions is what I'm trying to say. Is the concern that you have about the substantial risk regulations changing in itself, or is the concern that you've got about the quality of assessments, the ability to challenge those assessments, and the ability to provide essentially what is an IPS system for people who've got complex needs, etc., going forwards?
I mean, we are concerned about the changes proposed to the risk regulation. So they play a crucial role, as I mentioned earlier, to reduce harm to people with mental health problems, and exist precisely to cover circumstances where any use of the functional criteria wouldn't adequately capture their ability to engage in work-related activity or not. And so the changes that are proposed narrow the scope of conditions that would apply. And if I may add, the current proposals do not change the LCWRA substantial risk regulations for physical health. They currently focus specifically on mental health related issues and have narrowed it down for particularly mental health conditions. So I think that is really problematic because there are many cases where people have on paper, they might look like they should be able to engage in certain activities, and they would be deemed to be in the limited capability work group, but because of their specific circumstances, which currently through the assessment process wouldn't be captured, they wouldn't have any way to, if these changes are introduced, to be, protected essentially and to be able to live. And I mean, I can give you many other case studies. We know of people who have attempted to have been nearly hospitalized because of going through this assessment process and not being, and where it was deemed that they should be in the LTW group, and the only way for them engaging with the DWP is very triggering for a lot of people with mental health problems. When they get letters, they are unable to open these letters. And some people, as I mentioned earlier, for them that can be the kind of point where they then will attempt suicide, and the risk is real, and I think this is what we are facing with and we need to protect.
What role do you think SIMHT should have in this process? What role do you think SIMHT should have in this process? Because, for a recovery model, if we stick with the psychosis thing, SIMHTs will put a lot of work in terms of trying to have return to work as a recovery aim, working with people under CPAs and stuff. So what's your view? Because it's the narrative is it's very much about patients having things done to them, and what about on the flip side?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people who are currently trying to access support through the mental health system and who are struggling to access that support. So increasing investment in, our mental health system and mental health services would be a good starting point. Increasing investment in community mental health services and teams would be also a great starting point, because then people would be able to get some level of support. There are other models, by the way, in terms of IPS, which has plenty of evidence that shows that it helps people with severe mental illness to access employment and sustain employment for a long time. So I think there are other models.
I'm evangelical about IPS, so it's...
there are many models which do work, and where there is compelling evidence that it supports people with mental health problems and severe mental health problems which could help.
Thanks. That's very helpful. I'm going to run out of time. So some of my questions about sanctionality, I think, have been covered. The main core I want to talk about in the time we've got is around the support and the schemes back to work, so universal support and work well, and your perspective of how well they are targeted at people living with disabilities or health conditions. Bearing in mind, from what we've heard, is that there's what sounds like quite a real risk or likelihood that the work and health programme and intensive personalised employment support programme is going to cease in the short future. So the broad core question is, people living with disability health conditions, do you think universal support and work well are going to cut the mustard for those in terms of covering what has been previously covered by those other two schemes?
James, that's good.
Yeah, I'm really happy to start. I think overall investment from government in these schemes is a good thing. Universal support, on the face of it, is a good programme, but it's quite small in terms of the numbers that we're talking about and hearing about. And I think it's disappointing that the investment in these schemes is also coming with a higher risk of sanctions or threat of sanctions. Which seems to suggest that the government thinks the answer to rising economic inactivity is to threaten people back into work. But we heard from the Health Foundation this morning, from lots of other reports and think tanks, that this is unlikely to work. Actually, it's our crumbling NHS and rising levels of poverty and poorer working conditions and lower quality jobs that are probably causing this economic inactivity. So I think on the one hand, these schemes on the face of it are a good thing. They're voluntary on the most part. They're tailored to the individual. They're investing in people. I think our concern would be they're still quite small scale. Not sure how many of them are actually come online yet in terms of people being able to use them. And I think if we're committed to actually getting more people into work and building trust, then we need to sort of ramp up what's happening and invest more, to be honest with you.
We would very much second that, and I agree wholeheartedly on the point of there has been some investment, and I think we welcome particularly the investment in talking therapies and IPS, that being rolled out, but that being accompanied by a toughening of sanctions is obviously problematic, because we know that people don't trust the job centres and DWP, and a toughening of sanctions will only increase that mistrust. We can only comment on the NHS talking therapies. I think maybe one aspect that we would say, NHS talking therapies are good and helpful, and it is important that we invest into these services, but for some groups that are currently either in the LCW group or LCWRA group, actually increased community mental health support and services would be more welcome. And as I said, IPS is helpful. We know that currently the issue with the implementation of IPS is that it is unevenly distributed, and given that we know about the link between poverty and mental health, they should probably be rolled out specifically in areas where there are higher levels of deprivation, and people don't know about this, and I think there needs to be more done to communicate it to people who might be benefiting from this type of support.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Selene Saxby.
Can I just build slightly on that point that Dr. Spencer was raising around mental health and his wish to diagnose a job, that I this recess visited my local job centre because we've seen a huge spike in those people who've never actually taken a job, who've come, very young people with mental health issues prescribed by doctors as now not being able to work. Do you think there is an opportunity to actually revisit entirely how we look at this space for those young people at this point in time? Because talking about sort of support of the community and all these other things when we're a group of people who've never been to work, that actually it's a pandemic hangover in many ways for these young folk. Dr. Spencer's idea of prescribing work, the job centre, everyone feels that getting these people in and working, be it community, voluntary, in a supported way, may well be the solution rather than the problem. Do you have any thoughts on how we might?
I think for young people, there are a lot of things, that are outside of like the DWP. I think we know that schools can play a major role in supporting young people's mental health, and currently, again, we know that that mental health support is not as widely available for many young people. I think, someone mentioned earlier the Resolution Foundation's report, and it was also the Health Foundation who published it, and which actually recommended that where young people should be supported in the most deprived areas, and specifically young people who are able to access actually university and go through that route should be targeted specifically, because they are more likely to have mental health problems and less likely to be able to access that support. And we would very much second that. In terms of work and young people, I think this is an area where we would need to provide look into that more carefully, and would be able to share that maybe in writing.
That would be fascinating, thank you. And so in particular, two programmes, the individual placement and support and NHS talking therapies, are targeted specifically at people with mental health problems. How effective do you feel they are?
Yeah, based on, I think, a European study, they found that IPS clients were twice as likely to gain employment and to work significantly longer than clients in other vocational employment vocational employment support programs. And they also found that the cost of IPS was generally lower than those other employment support programs over a period of 6 months. So I think the evidence is quite strong. And I think the reason why IPS works is that it is offered on a voluntary basis, and they get support to negotiate with their employers the terms of their employment and to offer that flexibility that people with mental health problems might require. And I think, and it is also delivered not in a job centre but in a healthcare setting, where again the issue around trust that I've mentioned earlier is therefore then kind of addressed, because that element in a healthcare setting is provided where they feel genuinely supported to talk openly about their mental health problems. And I think we know all too often in the job centre the problem is that people are not in an environment where they can really openly talk about what is going on with their mental health or other health.
Thank you. And I know you've already covered a lot of this, but is there anything that you haven't mentioned yet that you think the government should be doing to support people with mental health conditions back into work?
I think from our perspective, the most important thing is also to look at the employers and what businesses and employers can do. We know that there is a lack of understanding of mental health problems, and also policies sometimes are not appropriate to support people. We, as Mind, have a mental health at work commitment, which we have been promoting, and I think we would like to see more employers to sign up to that commitment to support and create work environments where people with mental health problems are supported, and where then hopefully people can sustain that employment as well.
Thank you, and to you again, and also to James. Was there anything missing from the Back to Work plan in your view?
Well, we just touched on employers, and that feels like a missing thing that we haven't talked about this morning for obvious reasons, but doesn't seem to be mentioned that much in the Back to Work plan. So much from what we hear, particularly from disabled young people, is that many of us are written off quite early on, not given the same opportunities as other people simply because of our condition or disability. And that plays out into adult life. and it can be really hard to address that when attitudes towards disabled people are so far behind where we want and need them to be. And that is particularly the case in many of our workplaces across the country. You know, I think deemed too expensive. We support many disabled people who've applied for over 200 jobs and haven't even had an interview, adjustments not being made. Actually, these sort of quite small things could have a massive difference, and could have a massive difference on the disability employment gap in this country. And so I think for us, Back to Work plan, some good stuff as we've talked about in terms of universal support, probably needs to move faster, have more investment in it, not very much in terms of what employers need to be doing, either carrot for employers or stick for employers. And they for us are the real sort of blocker for many disabled people getting a job and ultimately I think staying in a job that's fulfilling.
Thank you. Noel, was there anything else you'd like to add? In terms of things missing from the Back to Work plan?
I mean, alongside, maybe, I mean, we know that on sick pay, this was also mentioned earlier, the statutory sick pay system is really outdated and problematic actually for a lot of people with mental health problems. And we know that the committee accepted a lot of recommendations that we have put forward, such as, you know, kind of that required level of flexibility of phased return, but we know, and currently the pay rate for sick pay is really low, and that is not enough, and we know that that's been supported by the committee. But what we would like to see in addition to that is for this to be available from day one when someone is sick, and also to be extended to 52 weeks. Because we know that people can be struggling for a longer time, and currently there's no way to get that support, and it can then be difficult to. People are then signed off and are stuck in like trying to have to deal with the benefit system and get that financial support quite early on.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. James, can I just ask you, we heard earlier that the Work and Health programme is going to end later this year. Are the people you support going to miss it, do you think?
Well, I think the extent to which is voluntary and has achieved better outcomes in terms of people staying in a job because it's voluntary than going into an employment support programme which is mandatory. Yes, and I think that goes back to the point, actually, sanctions, conditionality, don't do very little, if anything, to actually get people into a job that they want to be in and keep them there. If anything, they do quite the opposite, cause a lot of distrust, anxiety, and even worse, as we've heard about from my colleague from Mind. So, yes, I think people will miss it to a certain extent. Again, unfortunately, like universal support, it's been quite small. And I think this is the challenge that we're facing. We've got a big opportunity. Halving the disability employment gap will bring £17 billion into our economy in terms of reduced welfare spend and increased taxation and national insurance. Our employment support programmes, the investment government is making in disabled people, is far short of that. And for me, that's the challenge that DWP have. How do we properly invest so that we can support as many disabled people who want to work into a job?
Thank you. Ruth, can I put some points to you? We recently had the announcement of increased work requirements for parents who claim universal credit. Do you think those changes will achieve their aim, helping parents find a job and, if they're in work, increase their hours?
Unfortunately, no. As people on the panel now and earlier today have shown, sanctions just don't work. They're based on a model of assuming misbehaviour and kind of punishing that and pushing people into work. But what you find is single parents are already, majority of them are already working, but they're also undertaking a critical caring role, and they face genuine barriers to work. And so this approach of essentially saying you don't just have to meet the 15 hours administrative earnings threshold, but you now have to meet this 30 hours as soon as your youngest is 3, it brings a huge group into conditionality who weren't there before. It's a kind of grey area. What exactly are the sanctions going to be on this group who are working but not working enough hours? And the support, the work coach support, just isn't there to help people increase their earnings up to the 30-hour level. And the barriers around childcare, both availability and cost, flexible working and discrimination in employment, majority of single parents and mothers, so there's a gender element to the discrimination, but also on top of that, a single parentism experience, just means that those barriers aren't being addressed. We had one single parent tell us every time that she reads the 30-hour work requirement, she feels sick. Her son's going to turn 3 next month. She already works 17 hours in a school and struggles with juggling everything. These aren't people who are sitting around doing nothing, and I'm not suggesting there are people who are doing that, but we're looking specifically at single parents. They're just not. They're majority in paid employment. They're caring for their children on their own. They're often dealing with trauma or challenging situations. So, they need support. And also just to mention the employer's perspective, which has been mentioned before, but Katie Jones' work from Manchester Metropolitan University shows that employers don't support this either. It doesn't help them get the right candidates in for jobs if they've already got someone in employment, and then they're saying we have to go out and meet a work coach, we have to go and search for another 10-hour job on top of this job. It just doesn't fit.
Mm. The department says that it will tailor the work requirements to individual circumstances and also to childcare availability. Is that reassuring?
Unfortunately, no, not really, because even the DWP's evidence in the past shows that the flexibility that is on offer with work coaches just doesn't follow through in reality. And what we've found is so far that people aren't aware of that. We have found, to be fair, that the rollout hasn't really gone full tilt, and whether that's because work coaches just don't have the time, or whether that's because there's a thinking, or maybe we shouldn't push this, or I don't know the reason for that. So it's not being rolled out as fast and as hard as it might be, which we see as a good thing. But that lack of certainty, that lack of knowledge of what's happening is going on. People aren't clear. And we just, on Sunday, I had a message from a single mum. She's got 3 children, works 20 hours in a school, manages to work it around her children, great. But now she's being told she has to find a 10-hour job on top of that. Her claimant commitment actually says she needs to spend 30 hours job searching, yet she's working 20 hours, they know that. She went in yesterday, tried to talk to them about this flexibility. They just didn't listen. She managed to agree that these weekly meetings she's now going to have on top of caring for 3 kids and working 20 hours will be after school hours. But then that was agreed in person. Then this morning she got a notification saying that the meeting was changed to 9:40 a.m. one day. So she's had to go into this rigmarole of requesting it to be changed. And we hear that over and over again. People have to, it's this cat and mouse. And these are people in work. Yes. They're people caring, really important caring work, often children on assessments or waiting for assessments linked to the mental health issues. And they don't need to be logging online every day to try and logistically organise this. These aren't people who don't want to work or aren't working.
What do you think the work requirements for single parents ought to be?
I mean, I think with this, we've kind of got to a situation where work requirements are kind of considered acceptable. Because, ideally we would say that they shouldn't be there. It should be voluntary. And even before lone parent obligations were put in place, single parents did work. But what is definitely clear is that it shouldn't be there until children are in school. We don't believe that there's a need to have additional work requirements beyond the administrative earnings threshold. And if there were to be, they should be more staggered. So something around, say, 20 hours. So your administrative earnings threshold is currently 15. It's likely to become 18 soon. So say you had 20 hours from 5 to 6-year-olds, 25 hours once they're 7 or 9, 28 hours when they're 10 to 12. And we do think that actually it should be tailored down from 13 onwards, because the idea that having a 13-year-old and maybe more or multiple, twins, whatever, means that you can work exactly the same as a single person with no caring responsibilities. It just doesn't add up. Just as much as having a 3-year-old at home takes more than 5 hours, so you're only reducing the work requirements by 5 hours. That doesn't add up. It's the same for a 13-year-old. It's a challenging age, the teenage years, to say that someone with that age child can work the same as someone with no caring responsibilities. We think it should be at least tailored down a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. And just looking at the benefit system more widely, how well does it recognise single parents' circumstances at the moment?
We don't think it really does. So even with this conditionality earnings threshold, we requested the high-level impact assessment, and it came back to say that, through a freedom of information request, it came back to say that the majority of people might be single parents, might be married, which is the exact opposite. The more detailed impact assessment that was done when work requirements were introduced for parents of 3-year-olds in 2017 was much more thorough and said that over 75% are single parents. And we believe it's a similar number this time who are going to be impacted. But the DWP isn't even monitoring who is impacted and the fact that they're single parents. So we believe that they're not initially even recognising the existence of single parents, but then secondly, they're not recognising those needs. So the idea that you don't have a lead carer single parent status, which has specific conditionality, yet you have a couple's conditionality earnings threshold, which in effect allows one parent to stay home, which we're not against, that's perfectly fine. But why isn't a single parent, the fact that they're both breadwinner and sole carer in most circumstances, why is that not taken into account? It's not just about childcare. It's not just about here's free childcare. That would be great and that is needed. But then people can't just remove their caring responsibilities outside of that. There's appointments, there's other things that parents need to do. So it's about recognising that caring role is important in and of itself and has a benefit for that family and that child and their outcomes.
Anything else you'd like to see changed in the benefit system?
Well, I think having that lead carer category specific for single parents is really important. Removing this threat of sanctions, because people aren't misbehaving, they're trying to do their best. And that, like everyone's been saying, just pushes people further from the job market, and it just creates this mistrust. More dedicated work coaches, specifically for single parents and parents more broadly. With the childcare, to have more priority access for single parents. At the moment, the childcare system and support available is disproportionately for higher earners. Single parents who are carers and disabled are excluded in a way that couples aren't. There's a lot of issues. The earnings threshold is above the administrative earnings threshold to get your free hours. So again, you've got people who are working but not able to get the free hours, which we think is a madness. Systems like the flexible fund that supports people on universal credit with upfront costs if they're returning to work should also be available for people returning from maternity leave. These kind of key times where just a little bit of help can keep people in employment, and also reducing the taper rate to try and encourage more of that carrot approach, reducing it to 50p, which was the original intention when it was designed. And overall, we think that there needs to be legislation to protect single parents so that all these kind of things are considered, that single parents are seen as a specific group with specific needs and responsibilities, and that's protected for both in terms of the way government designs policy, but also in terms of the way employers deal with and supports single parents.
Thank you very much. Our time is up, and we have covered pretty much everything that we wanted to raise. Can I thank you all very much indeed for being willing to be with us and for giving us very full answers to our questions. That concludes our meeting. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.